Welcome, everyone. Welcome. I'm Vicki St. Clair, and I'm your moderator today. I'll introduce our guest speaker in just a moment, but first I want to thank you for joining us. We're very excited to present these webcasts by Aquent Federal. This is the first in a series. For those who don't know, Aquent is a marketing, communications, and design solutions company. They've been working with some of the world's biggest and best brands for more than 25 years. And Aquent Federal has worked directly with the government since 2002, helping government communication leaders develop innovative ways to create and deliver dynamic content. Each of the webcasts we'll present is specifically produced for government employees and contractors, for those who are responsible for marketing communications outreach, for developing visual information, and creative design. And we work, of course, in both print and digital media. Today's webcast is scheduled for 1 hour. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, so feel free to type your questions into the chat box as they come to you, and we'll try and get to all of them before we wrap up. So let's get started. Since we're constantly overloaded, all of us, with sensory information, we wanted to launch the series with someone that Aquent Federal believes is leading the way in promoting communication clarity. So let me tell you a little about our guest speaker. And I'm going to put a slide up here so you can see that. She has a very impressive bio. I'm not going to read all of that to you because it's quite long. But I will tell you that Dr. Cynthia Bauer has worked extensively in communications. She's currently with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. She's the Senior Advisor for Health Literacy and the Senior Official for the Plain Writing Act with the Office of the Associate Director for Communication. Dr. Bauer chairs the CDC Health Literacy Council and manages the CDC Health Literacy website. She's one of the developers of the CDC's Clear Communication Index, which we'll hear about today, and the online health literacy training for health professionals. In 2013, Dr. Bauer received the Cecilia and Leonard Doak Health Literacy Champion Award and the McGovern Award in recognition of her leadership in the areas of health communication, health literacy, and risk communication. She is someone who's certainly put her PhD in communications to great use. Dr. Cynthia Bauer, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be here talking about CDC's Clear Communication Index. It's a tool that we developed in-house about 3 years ago and have been using internally at the CDC for about almost 2 years now, and we're happy to share it with our other federal colleagues and contractors. So I'm going to walk you through the index, what the different items are, and then show you a few examples from CDC materials about how we're applying the index criteria. And as Vicki said, we'll take some questions at the end. So on the first slide, we have why do we need to focus on clarity? And as many of you may experience in your daily lives, a lot of government information is not necessarily that transparent and that clear. And there are a lot of reasons for that, of course. There's the specialized jargon that we all have in the way that we communicate about the various topics and areas that we're responsible for. But there's also these habits that we develop over time in terms of how we communicate. So when you come into a government agency, you may be socialized and acculturated to particular ways of communicating about your agency's activities. And so over time, these habits build up, and the ways that we communicate can become potentially less clear over time. So when we think about communication clarity, we really connect it to our effectiveness as communicators, that we need clarity because we're focused on being effective in the way that we communicate with the public. And the second reason that we're focused on clarity is because of the large amount of information that's available from communication science as well as related disciplines like risk communication, decision science, cognitive science, visual communication. There's all these areas and subspecialties where the research is just increasingly pointing to the fact that people are not just overwhelmed by information, but they're confused by the ways that we have traditionally been communicating this information. So for us, this is really sort of the driving factor behind our focus on clarity. Now, this is not to say that clarity is everything when it comes to effectiveness. There are certainly other dimensions that are important, but for our purposes, we felt like beginning with clarity was really important so that we could potentially use some of our other communication tools and techniques to greater effect. So on the next slide, what I'd like to do is just give you a quick overview of what the index is. So it consists of 4 questions and 20 items that we identified from the research literature. These 4 questions and 20 items can be used to develop or to assess existing communication products. And these 20 items kind of congregate in 7 areas. They either deal with the main message or the call to action, the language used in the material or product, some information design elements, the state of the science, meaning what do we know about a particular topic at a given point in time, behavioral recommendations, because in the area of health, oftentimes we're giving recommendations about different health behaviors people should or shouldn't do, numbers that may be involved in communicating about the topic, as well as statements about risk. Now, not all of these may apply to the topics that you communicate on, and I'm going to show you how these items are broken up into different parts within the index. So one part may be more applicable to the topics that you work on, and for others, multiple of these parts might be relevant. So as I said, there's several different ways that you can use the index. So on this slide, there's 3 bullets that talk about where we see the index being relevant in our communication process. So the first one is about designing and developing new communication products. That's really where we see the potential largest benefit from our own staff using the Clear Communication Index. We want people applying these principles of clarity right from the very beginning, because as many of you have probably experienced in your own work, if you wait to try and bring in principles of clarity after a material is already in draft, or if it's going through an agency clearance and review process, that's often too late, because what you'd have to do is basically stop the product in development, go back and completely start over. And nobody wants to do that. So what we're really encouraging staff to do is think about applying the index as part of the design process from the beginning. And we've been doing that with a great deal of success ourselves. We've been designing new products using these criteria, and many people have told us it's very helpful in terms of clarifying things that usually only become much clearer during the development process. And I'll show you what that means when we get into the questions and the items themselves. Of course, a lot of us have existing communication products. We have websites, we have print materials, we have posters, we have brochures, we have reports, we have all those things. And you can use the index to go back and retrospectively assess an existing communication product. And the examples that I'll show you at the end, that's what we did. These were existing health information sheets that we had, and we applied the index to those, and I'll show you how you can do that. And then lastly, we see the index being extremely helpful in agency review and clearance processes. I know each agency sort of has its own unique features in the way that it does clearance, but all of us have some type of clearance that we have to go through. And so we really see the index being very helpful in providing a structure to how that clearance process goes. So for example, at the CDC, several parts of our agency are modifying what they call their e-clearance system. So it's an online database where people enter their documents that need to go through clearance. And there are various fields that have to be completed for the document to be entered. And so they're including their Clear Communication Index score in one of the fields in this e-clearance process. And so what that does is right up front, it tells everybody in the review chain that these criteria have been applied to this product. This is the score that it got, and people are aware of that information as the material moves through the review process. And then people who have questions about that, then you can have a conversation about the same set of criteria rather than somebody saying, oh, I don't think this is clear, and somebody saying, well, yes, it is, and oftentimes that ends up in a very circular argument if you are not sure which criteria are being applied. So on the next slide, I talk a little bit just about how the index was developed. As Vicki mentioned, I was one of the co-creators of the index along with another colleague by the name of Christine Prue, who's in one of our infectious disease centers here. We worked with RTI International, which is a research and contracting firm that does a lot of work for the U.S. federal government. And their subcontractor was Communicate Health, which is a health literacy communication and design firm. We went through a multi-step process, so we used a multi-method approach to doing this. We had a literature review, we did formative research with our own staff, we had an expert panel who reviewed the criteria at different steps. We applied the index to CDC materials at multiple steps in the process so that we were able to see how the criteria were actually performing before we went live with them. And then the final step was to do an online survey with a consumer panel of over 800 participants, and they reviewed either what we were calling an original material, which means a CDC material developed how we would do it without the index. And then there was a parallel set of those materials developed redesigned with the index. And overall, the index design materials were rated more favorably by this consumer panel. So we felt reassured by that finding, because we felt like that's what you really want to see. You want to see that applying the index criteria will give you products that your primary audience will definitely see as more understandable and more user-friendly. Okay, so let's turn to today's task, which is to learn about the specific index items and what they mean and how to apply them. So just the next slide is just a transition slide reminding you that there are 4 questions and 20 items in the index. So let's take a look at what those 4 questions are before you begin the scoring process. So on this slide, you can see that the first question is, who is your primary audience? And I know that a lot of communicators feel like they already sort of answer that question maybe in their heads. But one of the things that we found is that by forcing people to explicitly articulate who that audience is, it brings a lot of clarity actually to the communication product development process. And so what do I mean by that? So a lot of times when we ask our own staff, who do they think they're communicating with, they will say, well, we're communicating with the general public, or we're communicating with, parents. But when you really start to, dig a little bit deeper on those responses, what you find is that in their heads, they really have a much smaller group of people that they're trying to reach with this information. So it may indeed be parents, but it's really a subset of parents. It may be parents of, school-age children. So it's not really all parents, but it's parents with children in a particular age range. Or it may be parents who participate in a certain kind of activity. And so we find that by really getting people to focus on the primary audience, it's not to say that there might not be secondary audiences, but it's really important to focus on who is that primary audience, who is it most important that you try and reach with this information. So that's that very first question that people have to think about before they even begin the scoring process. The second question is to think about their health literacy skills. Now, maybe you're not an agency that works in the area of health. You may work on transportation, or you may work on energy, or you may work on, financial issues. There may be all different kinds of areas that topics that your agency covers. So maybe health literacy isn't specifically your issue, but literacy and numeracy skills overall in the U.S. population, the average is definitely at a lower level than most communicators think or realize. And so we specifically want the people developing health products to think about the health literacy skills, meaning those literacy and numeracy skills that come into play when people are trying to understand and apply health information. And we want people to think, the communicators to think about that in a variety of circumstances. So for example, recently in the Ebola response, we've been having to think very broadly about different kinds of healthcare workers who might be involved in that process. So it's not just a matter of education, it's also a matter of experience and what kind of knowledge people might bring to a particular situation in terms of processing that information. So we apply the notion of health literacy to all of the audiences, and we want people to answer that question for every audience that they identify as a primary audience. The third and the fourth question are about the communication objective and the main message. And it's really important to distinguish between those two because the main message is that one thing that you want people to remember and take away from your information. The primary objective, the communication objective, is what you're trying to achieve by communicating in the first place. So one way to think about that is to say, why are you communicating with this primary audience? What is the real purpose of bringing them this information? That's your communication objective. And the main message is the thing that you want them to remember and take away. So these 4 questions are all open-ended. On the scoring tool, you actually fill that information in before you turn to the quantitative scoring process. One thing to mention is sort of the format for doing this. So you're looking at all of this in a slide format. But we have a website where we provide this tool in a couple of different formats. One is in the form of a scoring widget. So you can actually use the widget on our website, and you can walk through answering all of these questions and then answering each of the items one by one. And then you'll get a printout of the score assigned to your material. Or you can download an Adobe fillable form from the website, and then you could then go through the scoring process in the fillable form, and then you can save that to your own device. So either way, you can use that, or of course there's paper and pencil. You can always print out the form and use paper and pencil if you like. But there's various ways that you can actually use the score sheet. And we've made it available in as many ways as possible to make it convenient for people. Okay, so once you've answered the 4 open-ended questions, we go to Part A. So on this slide, you can see that we've labeled Part A the core. And by what we mean by the core is that these are the criteria that apply to the broadest set of materials. So we run the gamut from consumer health information to very technical scientific reports at our agency, and I suspect that your agencies are similar in that respect. So Part A represents those criteria that we have found applied to the broadest range of materials. There are 3 other parts to the index. There's Part B, which is about behavior. There's Part C, which is about numbers, and there's Part D, which is about risk. Those tend to be more specialized aspects of the information that we produce. And so parts B, C, and D apply to a smaller number of the materials that we create and release. But Part A, we have found, apply to a very broad set and probably are going to be relevant regardless of whether you communicate about health topics or not. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have the first index item, which is about main message. So the question is, does the material contain one main message? And you have 2 response choices, yes or no. And you may say, well, didn't we already answer that question in an open-ended form? And yes, you did. you answered that in an open-ended way. You, as the creator of the information product, you're saying, here's the main message I want to try and communicate to my primary audience. But as I mentioned, you can also use the index as part of a review and clearance process. So we repeat this question when you get into the quantitative scoring, because someone who is reviewing your material may look at it and say, well, yes, the communicator who created this thought that this was the main message they're trying to communicate, but I, as the reviewer, am not seeing that. So I am actually going to answer no, there is no main message to this material. And so what we did is we kind of built into the process kind of a double check on this notion of the main message. Because we have found repeatedly, we've looked at dozens and dozens of materials during the time that we've had the index, and repeatedly we are finding that many materials do not have a main message. They maybe have 3 or 4 or 5 messages, or sometimes it's even hard to find any main message. And so it's really important that people understand how important it is to be clear about what that main message is, so that you as the communicator see it in the creation process, and that your reviewers can see it as they're doing this double check. So question 1 is, does the material contain one main message? Next slide is about the main message being on the first page. So now you're answering a question, where is that main message? Have you put it in a place to make it most likely for your readers or your viewers to find it? And so again, you're answering yes or no, is the main message at the top, beginning, or front of the material? One thing I want to point out is that a lot of the materials that we produce are in print, either on they might end up in a paper format, or they end up on our website, or as a PDF that's posted on our website. But even if we're recording, for example, a podcast or a video, we have to begin with a written script. So you can still apply many of these same criteria to, for example, your podcast script. And so that's why this criteria is worded in this particular way, because it's asking, even in a script, have you put your main message at the beginning of that process? So that's question 2. Question 3 on the next slide is about emphasizing your main message with visual cues. So obviously this is most relevant if it's in a print or web-based material. We don't apply this criteria if, for example, it's going to be part of a podcast or a video script. So, but again, you have to do something to make sure that it's easy for your readers to find the main message that you've included. Item 4 is about having a visual supporting the main message. This is really important because we know that visuals, while they can help explain information, they can also be incredibly distracting, because we know that people are attracted to visual elements. And so if someone looks at your visual element first, let's say they don't look at your headline or your first paragraph, let's say they look at whatever visual element you've included in your material, you want that visual element to deliver the same main message as if they had looked at the written information. And so you can see that these first 4 items really emphasize the importance of the main message, because that, again, is that one thing that you want people to take away. Each one of these, as you can see, are answered in a yes-no format, and that's true for all 20 items in the quantified part of the index. The next item, number 5, is about the call to action. And so, again, in our materials, it's very important that people are clear what we're recommending or suggesting that they do. And so there's an item that says, does the material include one or more calls to action for the primary audience? Again, there can be calls to action for other people in your material, but it has to be a call to action specifically linked to your primary audience. Item number 6 is about having active voice. This asks about the main message and the call to action both have to use the active voice, because we know that active voice makes it clear for people to know who's doing the action. This can be particularly challenging in government communication because there's many ways in which we're reinforced in using passive voice writing. And ideally you would use active voice throughout your piece because that's consistent with the federal plain language guidelines. But in terms of the scoring, we're asking you just to focus on the main message and the call to action being in active voice. Item number 7 is our item about jargon, and it talks about the material being in the language of the primary audience. And you can see that the standard that we've articulated here about the material using the language the primary audience would use is a little bit higher standard than just saying, is there jargon in the piece? We really want you to think about the primary audience, how they communicate, and the language that they would find familiar and they would recognize. And so that's why this criterion is worded the way that it is. You have to be consistent with the language your primary audience would use. So items number 8, 9, and 10 are the ones about information design. So item number 8 is about using bulleted or numbered lists. So you can see here we're not asking you to assess qualitatively, is it a good bulleted list or is it a good numbered list? We're just asking you to assess presence or absence. Does this material use bulleted or numbered lists, yes or no? Once you've made that determination, then we direct our staff to go back and assess qualitatively if it's a good list. Is it a list of like items? Is it a list that makes sense in terms of the way that you group things together? So we oftentimes see a bulleted list that has very specific items and very general items, and we often recommend then that people actually break them into 2 lists. But at this stage, you're just assessing presence or absence. Item number 9, you're looking at the material and determining if there are chunks with headings. Now there are more specific directions in the full score sheet for each one of these items. So the full directions for item number 9 say that your chunks have to match the headings. And so you can't have information about a different subtopic if it's not included in the heading. In that case, you would score no. And so there's directions that give the scorers more specific help in terms of making the determination. And then item number 10, the last one about design, says have you put the most important information first, either in the first paragraph or the first section, depending on how long the material is or how it's divided up. Item number 11, which is the last one in Part A, the core, talks about the state of the science. And again, if you're not a science-based agency, you might have to adjust this one a little bit. But for any agency that deals with science at all, this is particularly helpful and comes from 2 areas of research, on science literacy as well as on crisis and emergency risk communication. Because one of the things that we know is in a crisis and emergency, people want to know a couple of things up front. They want to know what you know about the situation. But equally important, they want to know what you don't know and what you're doing to find out. And so item number 11 says, even on those topics that you think, we know everything about this, there's nothing else, usually people are doing more research or they're, unanswered questions. And this item forces you to think about that and acknowledge, yes, there may be some things that we don't quite know yet, but here's what we're doing as an agency to get you answers to those questions. And so this can be somewhat challenging for agencies to think about. This is not a way that they're often used to thinking about presenting their information. But it is very important in terms of setting your audience's expectations about you potentially coming back in the future with either corrected information, modified information, additional information. So if there's questions about this item, we can certainly address that during the Q&A. So at this point, on the next slide, you'll see that what you do is you calculate your score for Part A. So if you're using the scoring widget or the fillable form, both of those are set up to do the addition for you at this point. If you happen to print out a score sheet and you're doing it by hand, then you would have to add up the number of points that your material did earn, and that's going to be that number over 11 because you've answered all 11 items in Part A. So your score could be anywhere from 0 to over 11 to 11 over 11, depending on how many yes answers you have. So at that point, you're done with Part A. Depending on the characteristics of your material, you may stop there. You may not use any of the other 9 items in the index. And that's fine. The scoring rubric is set up to work whether you use just Part A, or you use A and B, or A, B, and C, or A, B, C, and D. It doesn't, you know, the system works, the scoring system works no matter how many of the 4 parts you use. But for the purposes of the webinar, I'll walk you through all items so you can see what they are. So on the next screen, you'll see that we're beginning Part B, which is about behavioral recommendations. So item number 12 asks, does the material include 1 or more behavioral recommendations for the primary audience? You'll see that this is just a yes answer, because if you are saying no, you're not using Part B at all. If there's no health behaviors, you just skip this section. The score is not penalized if you don't use this section. It's just that the denominator gets adjusted, so these 3 questions are not included in your overall score. So you answer yes to 12 if you have a health behavior, and then you look at item number 13, which says, does the material explain why the behavior is important to the primary audience? Because the literature on health behaviors shows that it's not just enough to give people a directive about a behavior. You have to explain why that behavior is important from their perspective. You as an agency may have a reason that you think this behavior is important, but you need to also look at this in light of what your primary audience thinks. And you answer that question yes or no. Item number 14 then looks at directions, because if you're suggesting or recommending a behavior that people follow, you have to oftentimes give them directions, particularly if it's a new behavior. Maybe it's a behavior they've been exposed to before and they just need to be reminded about that behavior. In that case, directions might be less explicit. So again, this is not telling you, oh, you have to have this, this, and this in your directions. It's just saying that if you're going to recommend a behavior, that behavior has to have some directions attached to it. And again, you're answering yes or no. So on this slide, you'll see that you're calculating your score for Part B. Because there are 3 items in Part B, at this stage your denominator, the number on the bottom, is 3, because all you're doing is adding up the points for this section. So your score is going to be 1 over 3, 2 over 3, or 3 over 3, just for this section. Okay? So that concludes Part B. And then you would look at Part C, which is about numbers. You're asking, does this material include numbers? A lot of times our health materials do include numbers because we're explaining, for example, the risk that a population may be exposed to, or they could protect themselves from if they did X, Y, and Z. So a lot of our materials do include numbers, but not all do. So that's why this is an optional module in terms of the way we built the index. So you'll say yes. If there are numbers in your material, you're going to go ahead and answer questions 15 through 17. If no, then you just skip this part and go to the final part, Part D. So on this slide, you'll see item number 15 asks about the numbers your primary audience uses. This item is parallel to item number 7. So item number 7 asked about the language that your primary audience uses. This one asks about the numbers that your primary audience uses. Again, all you're doing is answering yes or no, and ideally you're not guessing at this. You're relying on research with your primary audience to address what you know about their numeracy skills. What are the numbers that are going to be familiar? One generalization I can give you from our review of the numeracy literature is that fractions, decimals, and percentages are challenging for the majority of people. Whole numbers are the most accessible type of numerical expression that you can use. Now there are some other techniques that we assess in the index if you are going to use fractions, decimals, or percentages. But in general, the recommendation is to use whole numbers unless you're sure that the people you're communicating with are familiar with those other types of numerical expressions. So item number 16 then asks, does the material always explain what the numbers mean? So this says it's not enough to put the numbers in an accessible format. It says you also have to provide some explanation of why the numbers are even included. So it's not enough to just tell people, for example, what their numerical risk is. It's explaining what that risk might mean in some context. So the last item in this section is about calculations. Based on population studies of numeracy skills, as well as some research studies that have looked at some more specific groups, we know that in general people's numeracy skills are lower than their literacy skills. And so this item says if you ask your audience to do mathematical calculations, you've potentially introduced a lot of comprehension problems for them. Number one, they could make mistakes in performing that calculation. But the other reason is that it can be a distractor. And you don't want to distract people with your information. What you want to do is present it in a way that's going to make it accessible to the largest number of people in your primary audience. So this item says if you ask people to perform mathematical calculations, that's actually introducing comprehension problems. So the scoring on this one you'll see is reversed. A yes answer is worth 0 and a no answer is worth 1 because you don't want to introduce mathematical calculations. So now you've concluded part C. You'll see that the denominator is once again 3 because you have 3 items in this part only. So your score is going to be 1 over 3, 2 over 3, or 3 over 3 just for this part. So now you're on the last part, which is part D, about risk. We often make statements about people's risk. So this is a part that we use pretty frequently when we score materials at CDC. So you answer, does the material present information including numbers that describe risk? If the answer is yes, then you continue and answer 18 through 20. If the answer is no, then you are calculating your final score. So on this slide, I show you item number 18, which says, does the material explain the nature of the risk? And this has to be, in our context, it has to be more than telling people they'll either get sick or die, because we usually don't communicate with people about a health topic if there's not some risk attached to it. So this requires the communicator to think about, what's the risk for this particular population? If they're in a particular geographic location, does that elevate their risk? If they engage in particular behavior, does that elevate or mitigate their risk? What are the things that actually affect what the risk might be for a particular group of people? That's what item 18 is really about. And so there has to be enough information in the material that explains the nature of the risk that if you were to test this with their audience, they could explain in their own words what the risk is for them as a member of that group. So that's item number 18. Number 19 talks about risks and benefits. And then this is attached to the recommended behaviors, because that's often, in our context, that's where the risks and benefits matter, is in the behaviors. So if you scored part B, which was about health behaviors, this says you also have to address the risks and the benefits of those behaviors, because what we know about from health behavior research is that you can use fear appeals, for example, to try and motivate people to do a particular action. But the fear appeal alone is not necessarily going to be enough. Just elevating their sense of risk is not enough to necessarily change their behavior. There has to be other things that are addressed that would be motivational from their perspective. And oftentimes that can be in the form of benefits. That can be in terms of giving them actions that they can do to mitigate their risk. There's other things that you need to do besides just give them one side of the story. Often you really have to present both the risks and the benefits. You can see here that there's a third response option that we've introduced, is not applicable. Because again, if you didn't score health behaviors, you wouldn't be addressing risks and benefits. So you could choose NA for this item because it might not be applicable to your particular material. And then finally, the last item, 20, is about probability. We don't use probability in every material that we create, but we use it a lot. So again, this has the 3 scoring options, yes, no, or NA. And from the literature, we found that if you are going to talk to people about the chance or likelihood of something happening, you need to give them an explanation of that risk in words or with a visual, and ideally both, because you're giving people multiple ways to access and try and understand that information about risk. So on the next screen, you'll see that the calculating the score for Part D is a little bit more complicated because of having those NA answer options. So if you're using the scoring widget or the fillable form, you don't really have to worry about these denominator variations because all of that's done by the system itself. But if you happen to be working in paper and pencil, you have to take into account, did you answer 1 question, 2 questions, or 3 questions, 2 questions or 3 questions in Part D, and that's going to affect your denominator. So on the next slide, you'll see that the final step is getting the overall score for the material. So your first step is to add up the total points that the material earned. That's your numerator. Then you add up the total points that the material could have earned, and that's based on the number of items you answered, you know, from 11 through 20, right? Because 11 is the smallest number of questions that you could answer. That's Part A. And 20 is the maximum that you could answer if you used every item in the index. Then you divide your numerator by your denominator and multiply by 100, and that gives you a score on a scale of 0 to 100. And we chose a scale of 100 because it was intuitive for most people. And as you can see on the next slide, it's also because we wanted to set a cut point, because people wanted to know, well, what's a good score and what's a bad score? And we made a decision for a variety of reasons not to give an absolute, attach qualitative descriptors to individual quantitative scores. But what we said is this cut point of 90 or above means that you've addressed the majority of items that make a material easier to understand and use. And if your score is 89 or below, then there's still a lot of work that you need to do, and you should go back and look at those items where you scored no or didn't earn a point, and you should focus your revision on those areas. So on the next slide, I just want to show you a few examples before we open it up for Q&A. So on this first example that's titled Thimerosal Original, this is text actually taken from a fact sheet that we had called Frequently Asked Questions about Thimerosal. This was on our vaccine safety webpage. And it was intended to address people's questions about thimerosal specifically in vaccines and more generally vaccine safety questions. And you can see that this is exactly taken verbatim from the fact sheet. It opens with 2 very long paragraphs that talk about 2 different kinds of mercury, methylmercury and ethylmercury. And as we point out when we teach this in our classes, our index classes, the promise that we gave people in the title was that we were going to answer their frequently asked questions about thimerosal in the context of vaccine safety. Now, there's probably a very small subset of the population that wants to know all of these details about 2 different kinds of mercury. If you really think about who's going to have questions about vaccine safety, it's probably parents, and not all parents, but particularly parents who are still have children who are getting vaccinated according to the schedule. And so these are not likely to be their most frequently asked questions. What are the 2 types of mercury? They're going to have other questions about how do I know vaccines are safe, what's in vaccines, those are the kinds of questions. So there really isn't a main message that this piece is opening with. It's opening with a lot of background scientific information. So on the next slide, you can see how we use the index criteria to revise this material with a primary audience in mind. So it opens at the very top by saying, some parents have questions about the safety of ingredients like thimerosal in children's shots. So right from the beginning, we're positioning that piece for a primary audience with a set of questions, and we're saying, you ask these questions, we're going to do our best to answer those questions. We put it at the top, so it's easy for people to find. We use active voice, so it's clear, there's a clear subject, verb construction there. People can see, who's saying what. We use the language of our primary audience, so rather than talking about vaccinations, we talk about shots, because we have formative research that shows that parents prefer the word shots to vaccination. And then finally, we inserted an image that shows the recommended behavior, which is to vaccinate your child, and it links in with that main message, which is, we want you to know that thimerosal is no longer used in children's shots except the flu shot, and that you can ask for a flu shot without thimerosal, so reinforcing that message of vaccination safety. So we clearly made a lot of changes to this piece, but we did it in the context of the information that was available in the original. Okay, on the next slide, I'm just giving you a close-up of how we changed some of the language from the original to the revised. So the original said, why is thimerosal used as a preservative in vaccines? And then it gives this long explanation of that. We changed the question to what is thimerosal, and we said thimerosal is added to some shots to prevent germs. Now, some people say, well, that's not precisely an answer to the question about what is thimerosal, meaning it's not a scientific, technical answer to what is thimerosal. But again, it's thinking about what is that question and what is the answer in light of parents with questions about vaccine safety. So we tried to answer the question from their perspective using their language about why they would even want to know about thimerosal in the first place. So on the next slide, I want to show you an example from a heart disease material. So again, this is the original. This was one presenting a lot of data about what we call heart disease burden, meaning the impact of heart disease on a variety of factors on people's health outcomes, cost, healthcare utilization, all of those dimensions. And you can see that it's just titled Heart Disease Facts. It's not clear who would be interested in these facts, what would they do with these facts, is there really a message about these facts, is there any kind of explanation about why these facts would be important to a particular group of people. On the next slide, you can see we provided a map that shows how heart disease deaths vary by geography. There's not really any kind of explanation about why these numbers would be relevant or what people should take away. Should you be more worried about living in a particular part of the country, or what is the significance of this of these data to show heart disease deaths by region of the country. So on the next slide, you can see that we took a stab at revising this again from the perspective of a particular primary audience. So we said, if you're concerned about your chances of getting heart disease, here's some information that might be useful to you. And we presented it in the form of a quiz. So you can see on this screenshot, here's the first couple of questions in this quiz that we constructed from the heart disease facts information. And in that very first bullet on the original, it talked about the number of people who die from heart disease and the fact that it's 1 in 4 people. So we kept that information. It's not that we got rid of all the numbers that were there. There were a lot. But we repurposed those numbers and we put them in a context of why it would be relevant for people worried about heart disease. And in this case, we provided a visual to help reinforce what 1 in 4 means. On the next slide, you can see how we dealt with this issue of risk, since oftentimes we're talking about people's risk for heart disease. we included the statement that the more risk factors you have, the more likely you are to develop heart disease. So rather than just listing, here's your risk factor, here's your risk factor, here's your risk factor, we provided an explanation of if you have more risk factors, the risk of developing this heart disease are going to change. And we provided, again, these visuals to help reinforce what are these risks, why should you be concerned about them, and the impact on the chances that you might personally develop heart disease. So that's the end of my presentation. That just gives you really a very quick taste of what the index is and how we've begun to apply it to our own work here at CDC. And I believe we have time to take a few questions.
Yes, indeed we do. Thank you, Dr. Bauer. A lot of information shared there in a short amount of time. And I think you did cover this, but I just want to reiterate, because we had a question on this, that it's not just the CDC that uses this index. This index can go across all industries, correct?
That is correct. And we have, that's why we made it publicly available. That's why we created the website there, the Clear Communication Index.
Okay.
And because we felt like it was a useful tool for people working in other government agencies as well as in industry.
And we had a question come in about health literacy skills. Are you referring to the ability to interpret the science presented to them? For example, if they're a lay audience or scientists, is that what you are referring to by health literacy skills?
Right. So in the score sheet, we provide more explanation of this. But any audience is going to come to your information with, a set of knowledge, a set of experiences, a set of skills that they will then use to interpret that information. So that's what we really want people to think about and why it has some relevance for professional audiences. So let me give you one concrete example. A lot of times we're communicating with health departments at the state and local level. If you get out to very rural parts of the United States, health departments may only be staffed at the county level with 1 or 2 people, and those people might be trained in, a couple of different areas, but they're being asked to cover dozens and dozens of health issues in their county. And so we want people to even think about health literacy in that context, so that it might be relevant in terms of how professionals can understand and apply the information that we're disseminating to them.
Right. And I think this is an important question because given crises, you have to turn information around on a dime in communications very often, more often than not. I seem to remember somewhere that this process really only takes about 15 minutes. Is that correct?
Right. That's what we estimate after you become familiar with the tool. And again, it depends on the complexity of the material that you're scoring. I will tell you that, I can, and I'm an experienced scorer at this point since I'm, a creator and I've scored a lot of materials. But, I can get into materials that I'm unfamiliar with, and it may take me longer because I'm actually having to spend a lot of time trying to interpret what that material is about. So I think it's also the amount of time that you have to spend scoring is also a good measure of the complexity of the material, because I will tell you frankly, sometimes I've had to spend 30 minutes on a material, but it's because the material is so dense and so hard to understand that I can't really even figure out what the point is, which makes the scoring process a lot more difficult.
Right. Yeah, I think we've all experienced that. This is another issue I think that many communicators run into, and it sounds simple, identify your audience, but it is something that many people struggle with to clearly identify their audience. Do you have a process for doing that within the CDC?
Well, I think of it, I guess for me, the analogy would be sort of peeling the onion. When people tell me, I think my audience is X, and I'll say, well, why do you think that's your audience? And they'll say, well, because I want to tell them X, Y, and Z. And I'll say, well, but why does your audience need that information? And they'll say, well, I guess they really don't. I really guess it's these people over here who need that information. I'm like, okay, so great. So maybe that's your primary audience. So if you get this information into their hands, What do you want them to do with it? Oh, well, maybe they're not really the people who are going to do it. It's really going to be this group over here. So that's why I kind of think of it as peeling an onion, is really getting down to what utility is this information? Who's going to do something with it? That really should be kind of the answer to your question about primary audience.
Right. And as far as the use of the index, do you anticipate, is this going to become a standard for the government use across the board?
Well, I guess in my wildest dreams, right? There is no single body in charge of that. What we're trying to do is, just work in our own space right now. So as I indicated, we're almost at 2 years. In February of 2015, we'll be at 2 years in terms of our rollout internally. And we do a lot of training, a lot of technical support, a lot of, just assistance to programs in trying to do that. And, as we can, we share this with other government agencies, our colleagues, for example, throughout the Department of Health and Human Services and whatnot. So, we think that these are a great set of criteria because they come from the peer-reviewed literature, and we've tested them multiple times in multiple ways in our own process. So I can say that we highly recommend them, but I don't necessarily know that there's a process for a, quote, government-wide standard. We think they help people who are trying to implement the Plain Writing Act, which is a law and which all federal government agencies have to implement anyway. So we see the index as a tool for helping agencies implement the Plain Writing Act.
Right. Now, can people outside the CDC take the training class? I think you said that was public, but could you just clarify?
We do webinars like this. We do slightly longer ones. When we train in-house, we usually do about 3.5 hours as a first go. So we haven't really done, we haven't been able to support that, outside the agency yet. But on our to-do list is creating a series of webinars that would be recorded and posted on the Index website so that people could access them on demand. It's just my colleague Chris and I haven't had the time to finish writing those yet, but that is on our to-do list.
Okay, great. And I think we have time just for one more question, and that was, does this methodology work on any type of content, print, online video, advertising?
Well, we've tested it on print materials, on web content, on shorter reports. If you use the widget, you will see there's a drop-down menu. Well, for both the fillable form and the widget, you will see there's an option for choosing social media content, infographics, and whatever. And that what we did is we stripped out some of the index items that don't pertain, for example, to orally delivered information, like the items about information design. So we've tried to expand it to as many different kinds of materials as we've been able to test it with. We don't, for example, apply these criteria to a peer-reviewed scientific article. We have not tried that yet. I haven't tried it with advertising, but advertising, depending on the advertisement, could be similar to an infographic in many ways. So we really encourage people to try it on these different kinds of formats and products and give us that feedback, because we would love to know, but we can't say that we've tested on every single format yet.
Well, Dr. Cynthia Bauer, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing that information with us. We really do appreciate you helping us launch our first webcast with Acorn Federal today. Great.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
And I want to also thank the participants who joined us today. We would love it if you enjoyed today's webcast. Tell your friends and colleagues where to find it. It will be available on demand for the next 30 days, and you'll receive a link to that via email as soon as it's available. If you'd like to speak with someone from Acorn Federal, you can see the contact information on your screen right now. You can contact Demetrius Goodwin. His email is dgoodwin@acorn.com, and phone number is 202-808-0565, 202-808-0565. And I want to tell you a little bit about what's coming in January. We'll be joined by Michael Lejeune, who is the creative director for LA Metro. They've won over 100 awards since 2002 for their creative communications. So he'll be sharing some insights with us into how they gained funding, how they won business from external agencies, and rebranded Metro to change customer perceptions and gain new riders. And that's it for today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and happy holidays, everyone. Thank you for being with us.